welcome everyone to part two of with the 2020 election. And we were on this webinar 48 days ago. And think what has occurred in the last 48 days. The pandemic has gone through its second wave, which seems uglier than the first wave. We've elected a new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett. The stock market has been very kind to us since we were together last. And oh, by the way, I think we've elected a president. And we have no better person than Ken Kies to unwrap and unpackage all of these four events that have occurred. Just to remind you all, Ken is the managing director of the Federal Policy Group and who provides sophisticated strategies and technical tax advice on tax policy matters before Congress, the U.S. Department of Treasury, and the Internal Revenue Service. Mr. Kies has delivered significant legislative and regulatory results for his clients, including major corporations, trade associations, and coalitions of companies with common objectives. Prior to the acquisition of the Federal Policy Group by Clark Consulting, Ken was co-managing partner of the Washington National Tax Service of PricewaterhouseCoopers. He's led international delegations and has also held numerous bilateral discussions in Washington with a wide variety of tax officials representing foreign countries. Mr. Kies has also served on the Chief Republican Tax Council and the Committee on Ways and Means in the U.S. House of Representatives, and was firm-wide chair of tax practice for Baker and Hostetler. You know, in summary, we've got one of the most qualified guys in Washington to talk to us here for the next hour. He also holds his LLM in taxation from Georgetown University and his JD cum laude from Ohio State University and an honors cum laude from Ohio University for his bachelor's in 1974. And has a wonderful presentation ready for us today, and I'm going to hand it over to him. If we have room for questions, please use the chat box, and we'll try to get to the questions at the end of the presentation. Ken, thank you for being here with us. We're so excited to be with you.
All right, thanks, Terry, and it's great to be with you. Let me start by actually doing a little bit of what you did, which was look at what's just transpired since we were all together on October 1st, because every presidential election year, people speculate about the possibility of October surprises. Well, this was a year of many October surprises. So since we got together on October 8th, we learned that the Congressional Budget Office had come out and let us know what our deficit was for the fiscal year that ended September 30 of 2020. It wasn't a surprise, unfortunately, because we knew it was coming, but it's still a number that should make your head want to explode. It's $3.1 trillion. Just by comparison, the federal government has only run a deficit of over $1 trillion, and it was $1 trillion, 4 times in the history, 2009, 10, 11, and 12. So 3.1 trillion breaks all the records. And in my last presentation, I showed you where our deficit is going. So I didn't bother to include that again because I don't want to be so depressing. October 8th is when we learned that. October 10 was when the president got out from having coronavirus. There was another October surprise. The second presidential debate got canceled for October 15th. That was after the first presidential debate was a dumpster fire. And as a matter of fact, Jim Woods, I think, who's an actor, had a great line, which is Donald, he was talking about the first debate. He said, Donald Trump, he did a great job in that first debate, debating the moderator. And there was a guy, old man, wandering around on the stage at the same time muttering to himself. Obviously, Woods is a little prejudiced, but another guy had actually a pretty good line, which was, it sounded like the audio feed got screwed up. And instead, they weren't playing the debate. They were playing a conversation between two old men in a nursing home bickering with one another. So that was perfect. All right. Then we had Senate confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, and we had an election on November 3rd, which we're going to talk about shortly here. On November 5th, we had a good thing happen. The Joint Committee on Taxation released its annual tax expenditure budget, which up until about 6 years ago, all the way back to 1975, had included inside buildup on life insurance as a tax expenditure. And why is that significant? If you're on the tax expenditure list, you are a target for being used to raise revenue. 6-8 years ago, we were successful in convincing the Joint Committee on Taxation it didn't belong there, and it didn't. And it was taken off the list and has remained off the list. Now, just a little heads up, a year after the Joint Committee took that off the list, the Treasury Department, who also puts out a tax expenditure list, they took it off the list. I'm a little worried that under a Biden administration, they might revisit that decision because they might not agree with it. I wouldn't say it's a cause for huge alarm because, frankly, most people only pay attention to the Joint Committee's tax expenditure list, but it's just an issue that's sort of lurking out there. November 6th, we learned that the unemployment rate for the month of October was 6.9%. That was down from 7.9 in September. The economists, who, by the way, have been getting this stuff wrong all year, were totally shocked. But just to be fair to the economists, they're not as bad as the pollsters. I wouldn't hire a pollster to screw in a light bulb. These people are so pathetically incompetent, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the House races in a second. So the Senate returned. The House is back in session. Frankly, they're not getting much done. They'll leave at the end of the week. They'll come back after Thanksgiving. That's when things will start to get interesting. Government funding runs out December 11th. On December 14th, the Electoral College will vote. And barring some unbelievable development, they will vote for President Biden. And then we've got Congress coming back into session on the 4th and an inauguration on January 20th. And from my office where I am right now, I can see them building the inauguration platform, and it's well underway. So those are a look at some dates. So let's jump into my presentation, and I'm going to talk about a couple things: the presidential results, the gubernatorial results, the Senate results, the House results, and some other dates to watch. So let's go to the presidential. And this is all against the backdrop of what I talked about on my presentation on October 1. Because if you recall, I went through a detailed analysis of the Biden campaign's tax proposals. The outcome of this election is going to control whether those proposals get enacted or not, whether they get enacted in 2021 or, as you will see, whether they get enacted in 2023, which I'll explain. If they get enacted, it's a big deal because it is a multi-trillion-dollar tax increase that will impact high-income individuals, corporations, et cetera. So as we go through these results, keep in mind that how these elections turned out and will turn out on January 5th, when the Georgia runoffs occur, is going to control dramatically what we see legislatively. So let's look at the presidential. We know that Biden has the lead on electoral votes. He's probably going to be inaugurated. He turns 78 on November 20th. Excuse me, that will make him the oldest president-elect in U.S. history. In fact, I believe he will be older than Reagan was when he left office, just to put it in perspective. So here's how the map looks. And you're going to see a common pattern here as I go through looking at the Senate elections, the governor's elections, the House elections. And the common pattern is the middle of the country generally is all red, and the left and right coast is all blue. And we are a very divided country. Just one comment about the number of votes that Trump got, 73 million. He came in second, obviously, but at 73 million, that is the second most votes any presidential candidate in history has ever received, second to Joe Biden. So for Trump, it's kind of, I said this to Terry when we were getting ready, it's sort of like he's in the finals of the NBA and his team scores 130 points, which is more points than have ever been scored in an NBA final game in history. Unfortunately, their opponents score 140 in that game, they lose. And that's probably how Trump's thinking about this, because he thinks it's like grand terms, like the NBA. All right. Here's the number of people that voted. Again, 165 million. Keep in mind that we have about 330 million people in America. So this is a huge turnout. All right, at the governor's level, I'm only going to talk briefly about this, but I'm going to highlight an upcoming piece of analysis that I think is actually a big deal, which is, and I know when I say this, people are going to go, oh my God, I can't believe he's talking about the next election. But the 2022 election is going to be a very big deal for reasons that I will explain. How the 2022 election turns out is going to depend in part on how redistricting occurs as the House seats are redrawn. The Republicans picked up a governor's race in Montana, which was held by a Democrat Bullock, who ran for the Senate and lost to Steve Daines. The significance of Republicans picking up another governor's seat is that redistricting in many states in the United States are controlled by either the state legislature and or the governor. So who controls those entities is very important, and we'll talk about that a little more. So here's a picture of where the governors are. There's 27 Republican governors, 23 Democrats. As you can see, it's the red in the middle, the blue on the outside, where there were victories. Senate results. This is a very big deal. Unless you've been living under a rock since November 3rd, you probably know that there is a runoff in Georgia to determine possibly who controls the Senate. Republicans currently have locked in 48 or 50 seats. Democrats have locked in 48, and there's going to be two runoffs. The first is Purdue against Ossoff, and the second is Kelly Loeffler against Raphael Warnock. Let me just go back to this one, just to give you an anecdotal piece of information about how much money is being raised. I don't tell my wife this, but I played golf at Burning Tree Country Club last Saturday, which is an all-men's club, which she doesn't care for. And I was sitting around with the guys afterwards, and they said, you know, David Perdue's a member of Burning Tree. And I went, oh, really? They said, yeah. As soon as the runoff was announced, several members wrote 7-figure checks. Several members. The amount of money that's going to be raised here is going to be mind-blowing. And let me just give you a number of factors that are going to impact whether Republicans hold one or both of these versus Democrats getting both of them. If Democrats get both of them, that means it's a 50-50 tie, and Kamala Harris, as vice president, would be in a position to break the tie. So that means these two runoffs are all about the ability of Biden in his first year in office to enact that ambitious tax plan that I explained to you on October 1st. So this isn't just any runoff. This is a really big deal. Okay, so what are the factors that may impact how it's going to turn out? The first is Democrat donor fatigue. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is Democrats raised $300 or more million that they spent in races against Susan Collins in Maine, against Cornyn in Texas, against McConnell in Kentucky, and against Lindsey Graham in Georgia, 300 million or more. And it turned out to be a complete waste of money. They lost every one of those races by 7, 8, 9 points. And there's an excellent article in today's New York Times that analyzes why Susan Collins won. And part of it, and it uses as part of their story, a guy who's a diehard Democrat who lives in Maine, who was voting for every other Democrat, but was so turned off by how negative the campaign was against Susan Collins, who we know is one of the nicest persons in the world, also was turned off by the out-of-state money that was poured into Maine. In Maine, they spent 180, it's either 160 or 180 million dollars in the Senate race. So when you look at the 300 or 400 million of Democrat money that was poured into those states, if you're a Democrat donor, you've got to be asking the question, what were they thinking? Why didn't they spend it somewhere where it actually might have made a difference? So I think that's going to impact their ability to raise money for Georgia. On the other hand, the Republicans are on fire. Roy Blunt and his wife came over to my house for breakfast on Sunday. And Roy told me every single one of his Senate colleagues is actively sharing their donation lists with the Purdue Loeffler people. And based on the number of emails that I am receiving every 10 minutes, trust me, he was right. Okay. I mean, my phone is about to explode. I'm getting so many requests for money. And then the final point about whether Republicans are going to do well or not here. Generally speaking, but let's just face it, 2020 isn't generally speaking, and 2021 isn't going to be either. But generally speaking, Republicans do better in runoffs because they tend to be more successful at getting their votes out. In terms of the polling, and you might with good reason ask, why is he even sharing any information about polling, given how incompetent they are? But whatever, I'll share it anyway. Purdue's up about 3 points, and Loeffler's up about 1 point. Okay, here's all the new senators that we've got, and this is relevant because the life insurance industry needs to be constantly educating new members of Congress. I'm going to talk about whether Biden's got this special relationship with the Congress because he served there and he's going to be able to work with them. And I just ran across a statistic yesterday. There are 200 members of the Congress today who were not in Congress when Biden was either vice president or a senator. 200. And remember, he only left being president 4 years ago. That just illustrates the amount of turnover that's occurring every election. And here's our crop of new senators. All of them need education. And as I pointed out, it's a 50-48 advantage right now. If the Georgia runoffs go for the Democrats, it'll be 50-50, and we'll be off to the races on enacting Biden's ambitious tax plan, and with significant consequences. All right, so there we are, and here it is: red in the middle, blue on the outsides, just like the governors, just like the vice president, and you'll see the same thing's true of the House. All right, now here's an important part of my analysis of where we are. It is very possible that Republicans will retain the Senate. In fact, I can tell you, even most Democrats in Washington think that. They won't come out in public and say it. Privately, they all think it. So let's assume they do. That would mean that Biden's ability to get his tax plan through is roadblocked. And therefore, in 2021, 2022, my prediction is Biden is unable to pass most of his tax plan. Does that mean it's dead? No, because of this chart here. This is the number of Republicans up for re-election in 2022. And if you look at the list, there's 21 Republicans up. I see at least 4 races that Republicans will have trouble holding the seat. Richard Burr's retiring in North Carolina. The Democrat governor just got handily reelected there. Tom Tillis the senator barely won his election. So North Carolina is clearly a purple state, if not edging to blue. Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, well, it's Wisconsin. And I think Ron Johnson's going to have a real challenge getting reelected. Kelly Loeffler, if she wins the runoff, has to run again. And we saw how close Georgia was in the presidential. And on these two runoffs, they're likely to be close, even if Republicans win them. So clearly, the Democrats will come back at Loeffler if she does win. Some people would say Ohio is iffy. My own view is Rob Portman is such a good candidate that I don't care who they run against him. He's going to get reelected. So I don't really see that one as a big deal. Up until the election that just occurred, one would have said Marco Rubio could have a challenge in Florida. But I have to say Florida looks like it's trending pretty red. But finally, Pat Toomey is retiring from the Senate in Pennsylvania. And obviously, Republicans are going to have a hard time holding that seat. So when you just look at that side, you would have to say there's a really very realistic possibility Republicans could lose the Senate in the 2022 election. If you look at the Democrat side, the only possibilities that look like they could be pickups for Republicans are Hassan in New Hampshire, because in New Hampshire, Republicans just took control of both the House and Senate at the state legislative level. Mark Kelly's got to run again in Arizona, who just won, but Arizona is not a deep blue state. It could be competitive. But if you're really just into wanting a high level of amusement, you should watch Chuck Schumer, because AOC made primary Chuck Schumer. And I'm going to be real torn as to which one of them I send money to. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not sending either one of them any money. But trust me when I say Chuck Schumer is looking over his shoulder big time, and he sees AOC in the rear mirror. So one possibility is Republicans hold the Senate this time, but they lose it in 2022, which would mean Biden's tax plan all of a sudden becomes a live piece of ammunition in 2023, except for what I'm about to talk about in the House. So let's go there to the House results. Heading into literally the day before the election, most all of the pollsters said that Democrats will pick up 5 to 20 seats in the House of Representatives. So where are we? As of today, Republicans are at 207. They have picked up already 8 seats or more, and there are 8 more yet to be called. And just before I got on this call, I was on a call with Congressman Emmer, who is the chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee. He believes that the 8 that haven't yet been called, the Republicans have a pretty decent chance of getting 6 of them, which would mean that Republicans would be at 213 and Democrats would be at 222. That would be the narrowest margin in the House of Representatives, I think, since like 1910 or something along that line. So unbelievably narrow in terms of the outcome. And just to put it in perspective, the day before the election, Charlie Cook, who's actually a friend of mine, he's a renowned prognosticator on congressional elections. He's been around forever. He predicted that there were 27 toss-up races in the House. Republicans won every one, which means they weren't toss-up races. I mean, Charlie just missed it by a mile. But again, he wasn't alone. Okay. So you look at this first bullet. Pelosi had told her delegation that she was going to pick up 5 to 20 seats. Obviously, that didn't work out. A bunch of incumbents, Democrats lost their races. They beat Colin Peterson. The Republicans did in Minnesota. He's represented that district since 91. Clearly, this puts Pelosi in a very complicated position as Speaker. And just so there's no confusion, she was approved as Speaker this morning by the House Democrat Caucus. By comparison, in 1998, Newt Gingrich was Speaker, and he told his members that they were going to pick up 30 to 40 seats. And he banked on going after Clinton over the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Even Newt, to this day, will concede that that was a very bad miscalculation. And the day after the election, Newt announced he was resigning, and he did. Pelosi, no such announcement. And indeed, if you look at the Democratic leadership in the House, it really sends, to me, a very bad message to a lot of parts of the Democratic Party. It's three people who are, two of them are 80 and one is 81, and they have been there forever. Their combined ages are 241 years. By comparison, the top three Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, Lynn Cheney, and Steve Scalise, 177 years. So the difference between the top three Democrats and the top three Republicans is over 70 years. But it doesn't send a message that it's a party of young people. To me, that's a big problem. It also explains why Democrats and Republicans really can't get along in the House very well. There is an ideological divide, but there's a generational divide. I don't even think they probably speak the same language. But notwithstanding all of that, unlike Newt, who resigned after the 98 election, Nancy Pelosi is running, but she is going to have one tough time keeping control of her caucus, because she's still got, where she lost seats was the moderates. So the progressives, also AKA the crazies, they're all back. And they believe, and I've heard Republicans say this kind of thing too, so just be clear, I've heard both parties say this kind of thing, but the progressives, socialists, they believe it was not the policies that they were for that was the problem. It was their message wasn't right. And again, I've heard Republicans say the same thing, and that's somebody in deep denial. But Pelosi's going to be dealing with that with a very narrow margin. So let's take a look at just how narrow it is. And so I've already talked about the fact that Republicans could lose the Senate in 2022. And I've said it may mean Biden's off to the races with his tax plan in 2023, except for one little problem. Republicans are clearly positioned to take back the House in the 2022 election. And let me explain at least four factors that contribute to their advantage here. The first is the census. The census is completed. The census is used to determine how many members of the House of Representatives are allocated to each state. Because our population is shifting south and out of California, it's shifting to places like Arizona, Texas, Florida. It is very likely that Texas will pick up 2 more congressional seats and Florida will pick up 2 more congressional seats. Both states, which very possibly would elect a Republican to those seats. So advantage number one is the results of the census are likely to favor Republicans in the 2022 races. Advantage number two is what happened at the state legislative level in the races. And why is that important in 2020? It's important because in many states, the legislatures draw the redistricting lines. And if you want to know how Democrats did in those state legislative races, go read the article from the New York Times of November 7th entitled "Democrats' Blue Wave Crashed in State Houses Across the Country." This is the New York Times, which is no friend to Republicans. The article goes on to explain that Democrats were hoping to flip the houses in Pennsylvania and Michigan, states that Biden won. In neither state were the state houses flipped. Republicans surprisingly flipped the House and Senate in New Hampshire, so advantage Republicans. And then two other developments are significant. In Missouri, there was a ballot measure that changed who makes the decision about redistricting, took it away from what was a nonpartisan commission and put it back in the hands of the state Senate and House in Missouri, which is controlled by Republicans, advantage Republicans. And then finally, in Virginia, a ballot measure passed, which did the opposite. It took redistricting decision away from the state legislature and put it into a nonpartisan commission. Why is that significant? Because Democrats control the House and Senate. So from the redistricting perspective, the 2020 elections clearly favor Republicans. So that's the second factor. And then finally, it appears that because the House Democrats are going in with the status quo leadership team, that's the way they plan to govern. And it clearly is what caused them to lose control. All right. So there we have it in terms of what does the country look like for Republicans and Democrats. And once again, it's all red, mostly in the middle, with blue on the outsides. It's a country that is very clearly very divided. As we approach Thanksgiving, I'm sure people are nervous about inviting their relatives over, not because of coronavirus, although they should be, but because of the fact that they might be on the other side of the political divide from where they are. I've found in our neighborhood, it's useful to just not talk about this stuff. All right. Again, all of this is relevant because all of it controls whether in 2021 we will see a Biden tax plan enacted, or will we see it enacted in 2023? I cannot remember a time when this early it was so clear that a midterm election was going to have potentially decisive consequences, nor was it, or is it, was it, I can remember a time where it's so clear that it really is a jump ball in both houses. So this is pretty unprecedented. Okay, let's look at some key dates, and we've already talked about some of these ahead, but we talked about the leadership elections. There's a runoff in Louisiana, but I don't think that's a, I think that's a snoozer in terms of, I think the Republican easily wins. I talked about the Electoral College, meets on the 14th. January 3rd, Congress is supposed to reconvene, but that won't happen because January 3rd is a Sunday. Instead, they'll likely shift it to January 4th. Just put a note on your calendar. January 4th is my birthday, and I'm happy to receive cash gifts. We already talked about the Georgia Senate election. The next day, the Congress counts the electoral votes. I am predicting by the time we get to this point, Trump will have officially given up, and there won't be any drama. People have been speculating about unfaithful electors, and that doesn't have anything to do with who they're married to. It refers to whether an elector would come to Washington and not vote for the candidate that they were on the slate of. And it's happened before, but generally it's a pretty unusual event, and I don't predict it. Then, as I said, the presidential inauguration. Again, I'm looking at the platform. And then just to let you know that there is excitement ahead, on August 1 of next year, the debt limit comes back into effect. And that could be a really big deal because we have run up a debt that is so huge, which we already talked about, and we're going to continue to add to it, even though I'm not sure we're going to get another coronavirus deal. That it may actually be something of a difficult task to get the debt ceiling increased. And this has led to government like shutdowns, chaos, and so on, and not a really good time. August 1, although August 1 is not the real deadline because Treasury has these extraordinary measures where they can basically pull money out of every little hole in the Treasury Department. So the real deadline is somewhere in the September-October period. And then September 30, the fiscal year ends again, and we've got to fund the government. And I've already talked about November 8th, which is the midterm election that is ahead of us, that could be so crucial in impacting what kind of tax policy we could see in 2023. So there you have it. One other item I would just comment on is, assuming for a moment that Republicans do retain the Senate, there are regulatory steps on tax policy that a Biden administration could choose to take. And some of them are pretty relevant to us. The Democrat tax lawyers are not wild about the valuation discount rules that this Treasury Department approved and for estate tax purposes, and might try and reverse that. Another area that a Biden Treasury Department might relook at is what I can have to describe as the very generous regulations issued under Section 199 Cap A, which is the 20% pass-through deduction, which benefits a number of people in our industry. The person who's likely to be the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, not for sure, but a good chance, is a woman named Lily Batchelder. She's currently a professor at NYU. She worked in the Obama White House, and she worked on the Senate Finance Committee Democrat staff. Very smart person, but she's very liberal. And so even if Republicans retain control of the Senate, it doesn't mean nothing can happen on tax policy that isn't relevant to the life insurance industry. And then finally, there are areas where you would hope there could be some bipartisanship. And one of the most obvious is the pension area. As you know, Brady and Richie Neal introduced another pension bill. It would increase the mandatory distribution age to 75. This is something Terry's been counting on for a long time. And some other things as well. And it's an area of bipartisanship and has been in the past. So I wouldn't tell you there's nothing that can happen legislatively, possibly tax extenders. I will raise a red flag that when you read the articles that say, don't worry, they'll be able to get an infrastructure bill because Republicans and Democrats both love to build bridges and roads, particularly down in Cincinnati where that bridge just caught on fire. But the problem is that people have been saying this for 5 years, and every article ends with the final sentence. But there is the problem of agreeing how to pay for it, as if it's some detail. So I just, when you read these articles, read them to the end, because the likelihood that we're going to see a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill in the first 6 months of 2021, I would say, is unlikely. Okay. Terry, let me turn it back to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, Ken, thank you. That was just a brilliant summary of what's happening up till now, and thanks for those dates to watch. It's great. I want to thank all of our clients and friends who are on the call, and several have asked questions, Ken, and I'd like to give them to you. One of the first is, what are the prospects of getting a new stimulus bill before the inauguration, and what are the prospects after?
Okay, good question. The prospects of getting a stimulus bill in lame duck, which is between now and the end of the year, are not very bright. And there's at least a couple reasons. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer just a couple days ago restated their view that the starting point for a negotiation should be the $2.4 trillion bill that the House has already passed. McConnell came out less than an hour later and said non-starter. The Senate Republicans passed a $500 billion bill in September, and they don't believe there's a need to do any more. So that's point number one. The two sides are still far apart. Excuse me. And they're still far apart on another issue, which is something that's very important to small business, colleges, universities, hospital, which is a liability shield from coronavirus lawsuits in the absence of a high degree of culpability. Many people on this call probably have seen a phenomenon, which is businesses are reluctant to bring their employees back into the offices for fear of liability if someone contracts coronavirus. So we're not going to get businesses back and running at full bore until there's a coronavirus shield. McConnell has said since this past June, he will not do another COVID deal without it. And Pelosi and Schumer have said they're adamantly opposed. And it's clear the reason they're adamantly opposed is the Democrats are very tight with trial lawyers and organized labor. So that's point number one. Point number two is one of the dates I mentioned in November, which was when we got the unemployment numbers for October, which came in at 6.9%. When Senate Republicans saw those numbers, they said, this economy, it's not doing so bad. I mean, 6.9% in the middle of a pandemic is unbelievable. So that was a factor in making the Senate Republicans going into the election feel like they had a defensible position on not having agreed to the $2.2 trillion deal. As it turns out, it appears they were right about that. There's a third development, and this just was discussed in an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday entitled State Tax Revenue Rebound. This article is very interesting, and it's worth taking the time to go read it. Many people thought that there would be a great argument for the $500 of aid to state and local government that Pelosi was pushing for because state tax revenues were cratering. As it turns out, that is not true. And it's not true for some very odd reasons. For example, New York, which has obviously had an economic downturn, is collecting more income tax revenue. Why? Than they were a year ago. Why? Because New York taxes unemployment benefits and the federal government dramatically increased unemployment benefits. So income tax revenues in New York, contrary to what everybody would have assumed, are actually up, not down. The other thing that's happened in a number of states, which has contributed to astonishingly good state revenues in excess of 2019 levels, is sales tax revenues are through the house. And I can personally attest to why this is the case. Every night I come home, there is another FedEx box sitting in my hallway that my wife has ordered from somewhere. In many cases, she has no idea what it is because it takes FedEx so long to deliver this stuff. But she keeps ordering them anyway. And as a result, state sales tax revenues are through the roof. And so those are the three reasons why I think it's going to be hard to get another COVID deal. What could change that is, in an instant almost, is if Joe Biden picks up the phone and says to Nancy Pelosi, get whatever you can now, we'll do more later. Just get whatever you can. Take the Republicans' $500 billion, just take it and we'll get more later. That's not a complete solution because McConnell will still insist on the COVID shield. And I don't know, I have said since last May, I can't envision Democrats ever agreeing to that. I have Democrat lobbyist friends in Washington who kept insisting they will agree to it if they get the state and local government aid. And I kind of understood the possible deal there, but I still just couldn't believe they would go against the trial lawyers and organized labor, and I'm still dubious of it. So the possibility of it happening in lame duck, I would say, is 20%. The possibility of getting one next year will depend on how the year-end economic numbers come out, where the unemployment numbers are. It'll depend on future statistics to tell us just how serious this thing is going forward. And you obviously can see with potential more shutdowns coming because of the skyrocketing number of cases that things could get worse here. So the jury's out for what could be done in 2021, depending on future events. There you go. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, thanks. That's great. That's certainly something we're all watching. Another question from one of our great friends: talking about Democratic donor fatigue, wouldn't the Democrats for Georgia just hit up the biggest individual donors, Bloomberg, Gates, etc., as opposed to trying to get smaller donors?
They'll try to do both, and it's an obvious suggestion. But even Bloomberg might feel a little burned. He sent $100 million, I believe, into Texas to try and beat Trump, and it was a complete waste of money. I think he spent a substantial sum in Florida, and it turned out to be a complete waste of money. The other thing that I would also raise, and is what happened in Maine. Again, the New York Times article in today's New York Times that I referred to earlier says part of the reason Collins won is that people in Maine resented the outside money coming in there. Now, don't get me wrong. Republicans are sending a lot of outside money in, but it's not coming in the form of $100 million checks. And so the New York Times article actually raises very specifically the topic of, in the future, people are going to have to think twice about whether this is a winning strategy to pour money in from all over the country into a particular state to affect the outcome of an election. But I think it becomes particularly highlighted if it's people like Gates, or it's more likely Bloomberg, are the ones writing a single $100 million check. So that's the only reason I would say it's not a given that they're going to do that. But I think there's going to be plenty of money on both sides in this race.
Yeah.
These races.
Ken, this question is a little more nefarious. Most billionaires strongly support the Democratic Party. With Biden's plan to increase corporate taxes and increase taxes on those making more than $400,000 a year, what type of exemption is he going? Are they going to be able to get to maneuver in this period? And the end of the question is, on the surface, if I were wealthy, I might move offshore.
Well, okay, so there's a couple of answers to that question. In 1994, in November, the front cover of Forbes magazine, or Fortune, I can't remember which one, said 24 billionaires in the United States are giving up their U.S. citizenship annually to avoid paying the income tax. All right. Republicans take control of the House and Senate, the 94 election, 95. I became chief of staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation. The Clinton administration, having read the Forbes article, sends up a proposal to go after people that renounce their U.S. citizenship to avoid the income tax. And it was complicated, but it had two features. First, we'll kill them, and then we'll take all their money. Now, that's a slight exaggeration, but it's not too far off. Okay. So Bill Archer, who had become chairman of Ways and Means, to fend off enacting or having to take that in February when we were passing a must-pass piece of legislation, directed the Joint Committee on Taxation to do a study of the problem. And it was a long study. We published it May 1 of 95, but there were key findings. The first key finding, and you'll love this. So just to understand how many billionaires had annually given up their U.S. citizenship, and by the way, the way you do it, if you're interested, and this may be important to the person who asked the question, you have to go into a U.S. embassy somewhere in the world sober and sign a paper that says, I'm renouncing my U.S. citizenship. That's how you do it. Okay? So in order to find out how accurate this article from Forbes or Fortune was about 24 billionaires annually giving up their U.S. citizenship, we sent a letter to the State Department we sent them the list of the Forbes 400 or Fortune 400 richest people for the past 10 years, sent it to the State Department and said, how many people on this list have renounced their U.S. citizenship? Because the State Department handles this kind of thing. The State Department sent a letter back that basically told us to pound salt. They were too busy working on world peace. At which point I discovered in the Internal Revenue Code something that I find alarming to this day, which is Committee chief of staff personally had subpoena power. And so I directed my staff to bring that to the attention of the State Department. We got an answer. In 10 years, 3 people who are billionaires on the list had actually renounced their citizenship. So it wasn't even true. But moreover, we also discovered there are only 110 billionaires in the United States. So if 2 dozen renounced their citizenship, we'd be out of billionaires in 4 or 5 years anyway. But the final point we realized, which goes directly to your questioner, is people were not renouncing their U.S. citizenship to avoid paying the income tax. They were doing it to avoid paying the estate tax. And you know what? If I was worth $1 billion and somebody told me, if you die, you have to write a check to the federal government for $500 million, you might think about it. Now, as a result of that whole exercise back in 95, legislation was passed that makes it more difficult for people to do this. It's complicated. In some cases means if you renounce your citizenship, you can still be subject to the estate tax for 10 years if you die, or you have to pay tax on the unrealized gain in your assets. In other words, it's not as simple as it used to be. It's a much more complex thing. But going to your point about billionaires being Democrats, you know what? They're not worried about the top rate of the income tax because most of their gain is unrealized. And to the extent they get it, it's capital gain, although Biden would raise the capital gain rate on long-term income to ordinary income rates. But the billionaires of the world, they're not the ones worried about it. It's the people who are coming up trying to actually accumulate wealth that are terrified at top marginal income tax rates, which I shared on our last call, of as high as 69.1% in California. The people that are going to get creamed by that are not the billionaires of the world because they've already got their wealth. What would cream the billionaires of the world is a wealth tax or a tax that marks to market the value of their assets. Those are both things that Elizabeth Warren thinks are good ideas. So obviously we know they aren't. But they're also completely unadministrable from a practical standpoint. And even brilliant countries like France, who did enact a wealth tax, have abandoned it. So I don't think we're going to follow in the path of old France. So that's part of the reason billionaires don't care. They've already got their money, and there really isn't much you can do to them. So there you have it.
Yeah. Well, Ken, another question has come in, a couple of them actually, with regards to the election, and that is there much validity to the legal challenges, voter fraud, whatever, being made by the Trump campaign? Will this go anywhere?
Okay, so the answer to that's pretty simple, which is there's no evidence yet. And if the evidence doesn't show up pretty soon, it's too late. But I don't want to tell anybody it's not true because it might be. But it just might be isn't good enough. When it comes to challenging outcomes, election outcomes, ultimately you got to prove it in court. And so far, Republicans or the Trump people haven't been able to do that. Having said that, it is alarming when you, again, I don't trust polls, just to be clear, but it's alarming when you see a poll out today or yesterday, 68% of people polled don't think the outcome of the election was rigged. This is really bad because it means, and 33% of independents think that. And this is very bad because it means that there's a lack of confidence in the integrity of the elections. But in the case of the current presidential, I don't think I don't think there's no evidence that's been presented yet that would be persuasive, and time is running out. So it's unlikely to change the outcome of the election. But there's a serious relook that needs to be done at, I'll just give you one example. In a number of states, if you vote in person, there's somebody that checks your signature against the signature on the voting rolls. If you vote by mail, they don't do that. Now that is generally thought of in constitutional parlance as an equal protection problem. You're treating two different voters to a different standard. And it becomes pretty relevant when statistically the number of votes that have been disallowed is dramatically different depending on whether they voted in mail or voted in person. If there was a case that the Trump people could make that could get it all the way to the Supreme Court, it would be something like that, but it doesn't appear to me like that is happening. But if we're coming off this election with 68% of the people believing it's rigged, now keep in mind, if 68% think it's rigged, there's a lot of people in that group that are Biden voters. So that's really alarming, okay? I mean, it would be one thing if all the Trump voters thought it was rigged. Well, hell yeah, of course they think it's rigged. They lost, okay? But if it's 68%, it's more of a problem than just one side being sore losers. Okay, enough about that.
Ken, in the last talk on October 1, you talked about retroactivity. And so this one is regarding the estate tax. Is it possible to do a reduction in the estate tax exemption and make it retroactive to 1/1/21?
It is clearly possible, and I believe I talked about the seminal Supreme Court case is the Carlton case, which kind of basically says Congress can pass retroactive legislation that goes back at least a year, and they probably haven't strayed across the unconstitutional line. So in what now appears to be the unlikely possibility that Democrats get control of the Senate by winning both of the runoffs, I still think we're talking about a very real possibility of a Biden tax plan being enacted by the August recess of 2021 and being retroactive generally to January 1, 2021. But just full disclaimer, there are a bunch of Democrat lobbyists who were running around town before the election telling everybody, oh, don't worry, they won't possibly do that. And I believe they were spinning their clients, which is really kind of unseemly. But again, what I mentioned in our October 1 call is the last relevant example is 1993, when the Clinton tax increase bill was signed into law August 14, I believe, of 1993, retroactive to January 1, 1993. So I think the possibility of a retroactive change is very real. But as I said, I think Republicans are likely to retain the Senate, in which case this problem goes away, but not necessarily forever. Because of what I've talked about in terms of the 2022 elections. So we could be having this same conversation at the same time of the year in 2022. So I've got my presentation all ready to go. It's just going to be the same stuff all over again, but maybe some of your clients will have forgotten it. So anyway.
Well, we'll look forward to that. And one last question, Ken, if you'll look deep into your crystal ball and tell us, in 2024, does President Trump run again? And if not, who might be the Republican candidate for president?
Okay, so a couple answers. It's possible he runs again. And one of the unanswered questions, assuming he finally concedes here, is what happens to his political movement? And it is a movement. I mean, people that have gone to these rallies say it's electric. And it's him. So the question is, okay, the notion of Donald Trump going away and being silent for the next 4 years, that is a zero probability, okay? So the question is, does he want to run again? And he would be 78, but frankly, this is hard to believe, but he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke. He obviously doesn't have a very healthy diet, but it doesn't seem to be hurting him. And his energy level is like off the chart, off the chart. So now 4 years can do a lot to somebody at that age. So, I think it's possible he runs. I think it's possible he doesn't. If he doesn't, we will have a very spirited primary on the Republican side. And there are some obvious possibilities. Pence would obviously think he could run. Paul Ryan might come back. Kristi Noem, who's the governor of South Dakota, Nikki Haley, who was governor of South Carolina and then our ambassador to the UN. I mean, we could expect to have a very substantial field of Republicans, which is a good and bad thing. It's a good thing because you go, everybody, we're looking everywhere. It's a bad thing because it means you have like these horrible debates where like everybody gets 30 seconds to say I'm Ken Kies. But there would be a lot of people running because there would be the assumption that there's a very good chance of beating Biden. And I don't mean this in an unkind way, assuming he's still president. And that, you know, there's the obvious health issues that have been speculated about, but Republicans, I think, in 2024, there'd be a long list of people thinking that they have a shot at taking out Joe Biden or a Kamala Harris, depending on what the circumstances are.
Yeah. Well, Ken, thanks so much. I mean, I'm speaking for all 150 or 60 of us that are on the call. This has been a spirited conversation and well worth the hour that you spent with us. Can't thank you enough. I hope that all of you, all of our friends on the call, and Ken, you especially, and your family have a healthy and safe and wonderful Thanksgiving. And be careful, everyone, and stay tuned for additional comments from HORAN on these things beginning early next year. Ken, thank you enough.
Thanks, Terry. Happy Thanksgiving to you.